Thank you for leading us, Steve, in prayer. We'd like to welcome now those who are joining us online to listen to the sermon. You're very welcome with us. And we're going to have the reading from the Word now, and Stephanie, I think, is going to come and read to us from Genesis chapter 33, verses 1 to 20, and start finding it.
Jacob looked up, and there was Esau coming with his 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants. He put the female servants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear. He himself went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Then Esau looked up and saw the women and children. "Who are these with you?" he asked. Jacob answered, "They are the children God has graciously given your servant." Then the female servants and their children approached and bowed down. Next, Leah and her children came and bowed down. Last of all came Joseph and Rachel, and they too bowed down. Esau asked, "What's the meaning of all these flocks and herds I met?" "To find favor in your eyes, my lord," he said. But Esau said, "I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." "No, please," said Jacob. "If I have found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you have received me favorably. Please accept the present that was brought to you, for God has been gracious to me, and I have all I need." And because Jacob insisted, Esau accepted it. Then Esau said, "Let us be on our way. I'll accompany you." But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are tender, and that I must care for the ewes and cows that are nursing their young. If they're driven hard just one day, all the animals will die. So let my Lord go on ahead of his servant, while I move along slowly at the pace of the flocks and herds before me, and the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." Esau said, "Then let me leave some of my men with you." "But why do that?" Jacob asked. "Just let me find favor in the eyes of the Lord." So that day, Jacob started on his way back to Seir. Jacob, however, went to Succoth, where he built a place for himself and made shelters for his livestock. That is why the place is called Succoth. After Jacob came from Paddan Aram, he arrived safely at the city of Shechem in Canaan and camped within sight of the city. For 100 pieces of silver, he bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, the plot of ground where he pitched his tent. There he set up an altar and called it El Elohe Israel.
Steph, thank you very much. Well, please do keep your Bibles open at Genesis chapter 33. Well, good evening. If we've not met before, my name is Hugh. It's great to be with you. Special welcome if perhaps you're even visiting for the first time tonight. Great that you can join us. Over the last few weeks, we have been in this middle section of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, looking at the story of Jacob. And as Antonio said earlier, one of the things we find out about Jacob is he is someone who is kind of chased by God's love and goodness and faithfulness, but doesn't always get it, doesn't always accept it, sometimes thinks that he knows best and his way is better than God's way. And last week, Sam was preaching from Genesis 32. It's quite a famous section of Jacob wrestling with God. And he comes out of that meeting, having met God face to face, with a new name and walking with a limp. He's sometimes still called Jacob, but sometimes they'll call him Israel. He's had an encounter with God, and it's changed him. It's changed the way he looks at life. It's changed the way he lives and responds. And as we look at this next section in Genesis 33, I've got 3 questions for us to ask. They're not particularly linked. They're just a bit random. That's okay. The passage is a bit random, frankly. But we're going to look at these questions, and hopefully we'll draw out a few lessons from this story. Here's the first question. Do you know how to say sorry? Do you know how to say sorry? It's hard to say sorry, isn't it? Why is it hard to say sorry? Well, it makes us vulnerable, doesn't it? It somehow exposes perhaps something we've done wrong. We're not sure how the other person will respond. If I go to this person and say, I'm really sorry, I've done this, I don't know how they're going to react. Perhaps they don't know I've done something bad. It's humbling. To say sorry is to somehow admit you've made a mistake. It makes you feel a bit smaller. It humbles you. It puts you somewhat at the mercy of the other person. How will they respond? It can be shaming. It exposes what we've been like, the mistakes that we've made. And yet, repentance, saying sorry, forgiveness, and reconciliation are at the heart of the Christian gospel. Christians are people who, more than anyone, should be really good at saying sorry, because we understand the depths of what it means to seek forgiveness. But I suspect if you're anything like me, you still find it a really hard thing to do. And I think Jacob probably found it a hard thing to do as well. But as we come to this chapter, we know that Jacob really must have changed. Something is different about Jacob. Why? Because he's come to say sorry. Throughout the stories we've seen, Jacob is full of tricks. He's full of cunning plans. He's full of his own strength. And here we see he's being humble. He's being vulnerable. He's coming to say sorry. Now, of course, he's not completely changed. We see some of Jacob's old tricks in this story as well. I mean, even in verse 2 there, it says he put the maidservants and their children in the front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear. If you remember, he's got 2 wives, Leah and Rachel. Rachel's the one he really loves. And so he puts them at the back. Why? Or to keep them safe. He's not sure how this is going to go down, and he doesn't want his favorites to get hurt. You see, some of this favoritism that has plagued Jacob's family is still evident here. But he comes bearing his guilt. He comes bearing a sense of responsibility as he meets Esau. Esau is his brother. And way back at the start of his story, we see that Jacob tricked his father into giving him Esau's blessing. And ever since, they have been at loggerheads. Now, Esau sees Jacob approaching and Esau's got 400 men with him. See that in verse 1. Jacob looked up there, and there was Esau coming with his 400 men. Jacob's right to feel nervous about this meeting. In fact, he knows this is going to happen. Back in chapter 32, verse 7, it says, in great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into 2 groups, and the flocks and the herds and the camels as well. He thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape. He's heard that Esau is, frankly, he's stacked with men. And when it says men, these are not kindly men. These are probably men with implements that could do you harm, shall we say. He thinks they might well be spoiling for a fight here. And so he wants to protect his family. And he approaches, you see, verse 3, he comes bowing. Verse 3, he himself went on ahead. So Jacob leaves the rest, he goes on ahead, and he bows down to the ground 7 times. This is how someone would approach a king who was in charge and had all the power and who could cut you down with an order. He approaches bowing 7 times. He's prepared for the worst. He's prepared that Esau might well kill him. And you wouldn't blame him if he did. But Esau has changed too. Jacob and Esau's mum, Rebekah, sent Jacob away. After he tricked him out of the blessing, she sends him away. And she says in chapter 27, verse 44, she says, go away until your brother's fury subsides. Rebekah is a wise mum. She doesn't try and get them together straight away, but around 20 years have passed now. Perhaps his brother's fury has subsided. And we see that it has, verse 4. Look what happens there in verse 4. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around him, around his neck, and kissed him. And they wept. It's a wonderful picture of forgiveness, of a family being reunited, of restoration. I think it's a picture as well that sounds familiar to us. You remember in Luke chapter 15, where Jesus tells a parable, the parable of the lost son. Do you remember that story? And the lost son returns to his father. You kind of feel Jesus has this scene in his mind as he tells this story. Lots of similarities. You see, Jacob approaches Esau as though Esau's the king, as though Esau has every right to kill him, and then they embrace. They become family again. It's just a little picture of what it's like when sins are forgiven, when people are restored, reconciled. I wonder if there's someone that you need to say sorry to. Do you need to, like Jacob, take a risk? Make yourself vulnerable? To do the right thing? To seek to restore and reconcile a relationship? Saying sorry is not easy. In fact, when Jacob went to say sorry, he knew how it might end. And yet he trusted that with God's protection, this was the right thing to do. Perhaps this story of reconciliation is a picture of hope for you. It's not always a happy ending, but perhaps something to pray for. I don't know your situations. Perhaps there's a relationship somewhere that needs to be restored. Something to pray about, perhaps. But at this point, Jacob he's a new man. He's been given a new name. His name is Israel, and Israel becomes the name really of God's people. And so as he approaches Esau, he approaches really as a representative of not just himself, but all of his people, his descendants. He's coming on behalf of his family. He needs forgiveness, but he's seeking the protection of his people too. And in that sense, he acts a little bit like this role that we'll see in the Bible called a priest. He brings a gift, an offering. He's seeking favor. He comes on behalf of God's people. And when we read through the Bible stories, we see Jacob's descendants go on. We see they will need someone who will act like that for them. Someone who, on their behalf, will seek forgiveness, will seek safety for them. Do you know how to say sorry? There's a wonderful picture here of reconciliation to encourage us. Here's the second question. Where does success point you? Where does success point you? Now, this stage in the story, we see that both Jacob and Esau have been successful. Jacob returns to his home with spiritual and material blessings. But Esau too. Esau's been successful. He's got 400 men with him. And presumably they've got wives and children somewhere else. By any metric, Esau has been successful as well. And Jacob is a man who's been forged by God's faithfulness. He's learned that it's not his schemes that have caused his success, but God's kindness. Look at verse 5. Then Esau looked up and saw the women and the children, and he said, "Who are these with you?" he asked. Jacob answered, "They are the children God has graciously given your servant." You see, Jacob has come to learn where his blessings come from. They come from God, from his goodness, his kindness. But by contrast, Esau is a self-made man. He's got all he needs, and he's earned it. Verse 9. Jacob offers these flocks as a gift to Esau to make peace. And Esau says, "I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." We don't quite know the tone in which that's said, but you can tell he's got enough. He's got all that he needs. You see, both have been successful, but they attribute their success differently and are now going to follow distinctive paths. You see, for Esau, now that him and Jacob have been reconciled, he thinks, well, him and Jacob can now go and live together. Verse 12, he says, "Let us be on our way. I'll accompany you." Esau, I think, is assuming Jacob's going to come and live with him now. They've reconciled, they've made up, the family can be together again. Now, they're up in the north at the moment. If you imagine I am the land of Canaan, the promised land, okay? Now, the land of Canaan is actually a bit taller and thinner, okay? But you'll just have to imagine, okay, I'll stand like this. It's taller and thinner. Now, they are currently up outside the land in the north up here. And Esau, his home is down in the south here, a place called Seir, or Edom, it's sometimes called later in the Bible. So they're up here, they're down here. And Esau's saying, "Come down with me down here." And what's he going to do? Well, fortunately, Jacob still has a few tricks up his sleeve. He's not lost his shrewdness. So verse 13, he says, and I summarize, he says, "Don't worry, we'll slow you down. We've got all these children and herds with us. There's no way we can keep up with you. You go on ahead." So we're up here. Esau, you go down to your home and see it, and we'll join you. We'll catch you up. So Esau heads to the Seir in the south. See that in verse 16. But Jacob heads instead to a place called Succoth. Now, Succoth is in the northwest of where they are. So they're going in opposite directions. Esau heads south. Jacob says, "Don't worry, I'll catch you up." But actually heads the other way. And by the end of the chapter, in verse 18, he comes to Shechem in the land of Canaan. You see, for Esau, success takes him to his home, his place, his land, Seir, down here in the south. But for Jacob, success takes him to Canaan. Not his actual home, but the home which God has promised him. Canaan is the promised land, the land that God has promised to his family. One heads south to his home. The other heads west to the home which God has promised him. You see, when you experience success in this world, whatever that looks like, whether that's wealth or fame or family or promotion or status or academic achievement or sporting victories or social popularity or good looks or just a nice house and a good holiday, that success will point you in one of two directions. It will either point you to your home, the place that you've made, the home of your success, or it will point you to another promise. The promise of blessing and land, not just now, but forever, for all his generations to come, for all eternity. Which way will it point you? When you experience the good things of this world, the things in which God blesses us, where will it point you? Will it point you to building your home here? Or will it point you to the home which God has promised you? You see, these things that we call success, they will try and point us here. You made it, you earned it, enjoy it. Here is home. But for the Christian, success is designed, like it did for Jacob, to point you to the home which God has promised you. A new home, a new creation, a place where earthly successes pale in comparison to heavenly treasure. To which home does your success point you to? The home you're building here, like Esau, or like Jacob, the home that God has promised you for all eternity? And if we looked at your life, would we be able to tell? Would we be able to tell which home you're living for? Where does success point you? Your home or the home which God has promised you? Here's the third question, final question. Is there more to life than comfort? Is there more to life than comfort? Jacob knows he can't live with Esau. There's too much water under the bridge. And he knows he can't live in Seir because God's called him to live in Canaan. So now he's arrived in this new land. After all he's been through, you can understand Jacob just wanting to settle down, to live a quiet life. So at the end of the chapter there, verse 18, we see he's arrived in this city called Shechem in Canaan and camped within sight of the city. For 100 pieces of silver he bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, the plot of ground where he pitched his tent. It says there in verse 18, it says he arrived safely, or literally he's arrived in peace. This for him now is a place of peace, a place where he can settle. And so he buys the land, he pitches his tent. We see then, verse 20, he sets up an altar. He calls it El Eloi Israel, which means something like God is the God of Israel, or mighty is the God of Israel. And it's a massive statement of faith for Jacob. This is the God who's been with him, who's kept him, who's blessed him. And in one sense, Jacob's done really well. He's resisted that call to follow Esau, to go south to Seir. He's headed instead to the promised land. He's made his home. He's set up an altar. But God's actually called him to go somewhere else. God's called him to go back to a place he's been before called Bethel. And we're going to see a bit more about that next week. He's called him to go to this place, that place a few chapters ago where he had a dream about the ladder, if you remember that. And he will speak to him again and say, go to Bethel. But this is like Jacob kind of half following God's call. He wanted peace. He wanted a quiet life, his own plot of land. And we won't go into verse in chapter 34. It's a bit messy. There's all sorts of things going on. There's, these sons, they're intermarrying with these foreign tribes. And there's this section at the end of verse 34 where he says to his sons, You've brought trouble on me. You've made me a stench to the people of Canaan. And it's just like Jacob just wants the quiet life, the easy life. But I've got to the promised land, Lord. Great. Now just let me have peace. Let me be safe. Let me have my plot of land. But here's the thing. God has made the most incredible promise. He's promised you a home, his promised land, his new creation for all eternity. But like Jacob, I'm tempted to take shortcuts. I'm tempted to rest here for a while. Because actually I quite enjoy the comforts of this world. I quite like living in peace and safety. It's much easier to just blend in with how everyone else is living in this land. You see, like Jacob, we're in danger of settling for comfort and peace in this world, selling ourselves short of where God really wants us to be and what he offers for all eternity. Often, I'll choose comfort. I'll choose quick peace. I'll choose the easy life because actually the Christian life, what we call the way of the cross, is hard. It's painful. It's often filled with suffering. It feels alien to the world in which I currently live. Often alien to how many of my family and friends live. And yet, God in his kindness keeps pushing Jacob forward to the place he wants him to be, to all that he's promised him. God's promises will lead you to a place of eternal peace. But it may not be a peaceful journey. It's the path that Jesus followed, and he invites us to journey with him. You see, even here, even in a slightly random bit of the story of Jacob, we're pointed to Jesus, a true and better Jacob. You see, Jesus is the one who comes as a perfect priest, the one who will lead, who will go ahead of his people and offer a gift, offer a sacrifice that we can be delivered safely to home. Jesus is the one who left his home with all its wealth and privilege to seek you in the wilderness and point you to your true home. And Jesus is the one who did not seek comfort. He did not seek the easy life, the life of peace, but he chose to suffer on the cross, dying in your place, that you might never be separated now or eternally from the perfect peace that God offers you. You see, this section of Jacob, it's a bit strange. There's lots of weird place names. But what we see is someone who had so much of God's blessing, who experienced so much goodness and is starting to learn, starting to get it right, knows that he can't go with Esau, knows he needs to go to the promised land. And now as we read through the rest of the story, we're just urging him, go on, keep going, as it were, keep running the race, that you might enjoy all that God has promised to you. Let me pray. Our Father, I thank you so much for Jacob's story. Thank you that in many and varied ways it points us to you, to your blessing, to your faithfulness, to your love for us. And Lord, I pray that in our successes, you might point us to our eternal home. I pray that in our comfort and peace, you might shake us to enjoy and experience all that you have promised us. Help us to follow the way of Jesus, that while it may not always be peaceful, it will lead us to your eternal peace now and forever. Amen.